The letter lay on the kitchen table, its edges crisp and unreadable until the moment my trembling hands forced it open. I had never expected a note like this, blunt and raw, to arrive on a chilly autumn morning, the kind when sunlight filters weakly through amber leaves. The paper was thin, almost fragile, but the words it bore were anything but delicate. 6 words, typed with clinical finality: "We don't owe you anything, just leave us alone." No signature, no explanation, just a cold dismissal that landed in my chest like a stone. I sat there, staring at the page, the ink blurring as tears welled up unbidden. It was from Emily, my son's wife, the woman who once greeted me with warmth, who had woven herself into our family's tapestry with smiles and promises. But now, those promises lay shredded between the lines of this merciless letter. The silence that followed was deafening. No calls, no messages, no attempts to reach out. Just that note and the sharp, empty space where affection used to live. I traced the words with a shaking finger, as if trying to find some hidden meaning beneath their cruelty. But there was none. It was the final severance, a declaration that the fragile bonds tying me to my family had been severed without ceremony or explanation. I thought of Julian, my son, who had always been the bridge between me and the world. Where was his voice in this silence? Had he even seen the letter? Had he condoned this cold rejection? The house felt suddenly too big, too hollow. Every corner echoed with memories: Julian's laughter bouncing off the walls, the scent of fresh paint from when we'd renovated the kitchen, the faded photographs lining the hallway. Now these relics of a shared past felt like relics of a life I no longer belonged to. The letter was a wound, but the silence that followed was a slow, gnawing ache that settled into my bones. I remembered the subtle shifts over the past months: the missed birthdays, the unanswered texts, the polite but distant smiles during visits that grew fewer and farther between. I had chosen to believe those were just the natural ebbs and flows of family life, not the quiet unraveling of ties I had thought unbreakable. But the letter was proof that the distance had been more than physical; it had become emotional exile. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the sky darken as the world moved on without me. The letter lay folded on the table, a silent testament to a truth I hadn't wanted to face. I felt the weight of years pressing down, the ache of rejection mingling with the sting of disbelief. How had it come to this? When had love turned so cold? I reached for my phone, fingers hovering over Emily's contact, then Julian's. The impulse to call, to plead, to demand answers surged and receded, leaving me raw and uncertain. Their silence was its own kind of message, louder than any words could be. I realized then that this wasn't just a family dispute, it was a farewell I hadn't been invited to say. Memories flooded me: Julian as a boy, his small hands clutching mine, the way he'd look up with trust shining in his eyes. I had nurtured him, protected him, believed in the family we built together. And now those memories felt like fragile glass, beautiful but easily shattered. The letter was not just from Emily, it was from a family that had turned away, a door closing with a finality that left no room for return. The next days were a blur of quiet grief. I found myself retracing every conversation, every visit, searching for signs I had missed. Was it the way I'd reacted when Emily mentioned moving away, the time I'd questioned them about their plans? Or was this coldness always there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to emerge? The uncertainty was a torment, a slow unraveling of the trust I'd placed in those I loved most. In the small hours of the morning, when the house was still and the world held its breath, I sat alone with the letter pressed to my chest. It was a harsh reminder that love doesn't always endure, that family ties can fray and break beyond repair. But beneath the ache, a flicker of resolve stirred. If they wanted me gone, if this was their choice, then I would have to find a way to live beyond their rejection. I began to write in a notebook, the words spilling out like a release valve for the pain I couldn't voice aloud. I wrote of the laughter that once filled these rooms, of the hopes I had nurtured, and the quiet sorrow of being cast aside. The act of writing was both balm and reckoning, a way to claim my story even as it was being denied by those I loved. One afternoon, I found myself walking through the neighborhood, the letter folded carefully in my bag. The familiar streets seemed different, tinged with an unfamiliar coldness. I passed the corner where Julian used to play with his friends, the park bench where I had sat during many afternoons of quiet companionship. Now, those places felt like echoes of a past I could no longer belong to. I stopped at a small cafe we used to frequent, ordering a cup of tea and sitting by the window. Watching people come and go, families laughing and sharing moments, I felt both a part of the world and painfully apart from it. The letter's words echoed in my mind, a refrain that refused to fade: "We don't owe you anything, just leave us alone." Yet, as the days slipped by, I found myself resisting the impulse to disappear completely. There was a stubbornness in me, a refusal to be erased so quietly. I began to consider what it meant to live in this new reality where the family I had known was now a stranger. How could I rebuild when the foundation beneath me had crumbled? The silence that followed the letter was the hardest part. No explanations, no attempts at dialogue, just a vacuum where connection used to be. I tried to reach out, sending messages that went unanswered, leaving voicemail after voicemail that dissolved into the void. Each rejection deepened the ache but also crystallized a painful truth: some wounds are inflicted not by words but by absence. I thought of the years ahead, the milestones I might miss, the celebrations that would now pass without me. The grief was a slow burn, a series of quiet losses unfolding in the shadow of that cold letter. But within that grief, a seed of acceptance began to take root. If they chose to shut me out, I would have to find a way to live, not as a shadow of what was, but as someone new. As twilight deepened into night, I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not out of denial, but because it no longer needed to dominate my every thought. It was a scar, a reminder of pain, but not the whole story. I would carry it with me, but I would also carry myself forward. The family I had known was gone, replaced by silence and distance. But I was still here, breathing, feeling, and slowly awakening to the possibility of a life beyond this heartbreak. The letter had severed the ties, but it had not broken me, not yet. The decision came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic declarations. One morning, as pale light filtered through the curtains, I found myself standing in the living room of the house that had once been the heart of our family, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the mantelpiece. The photographs lining the walls, the smiling faces frozen in time, seemed to watch me as I contemplated the future. This house, with its creaking floors and sunlit windows, had cradled Julian's childhood and echoed with the laughter of better days. Now it felt like a relic of a past that had slipped beyond my grasp. I had always imagined that this home would be a sanctuary, a place where the generations of our family would gather and grow. But the coldness that had seeped into our relationships had turned it into a silent witness of estrangement. The letter from Emily, the absence of Julian's voice, and the growing distance had transformed these walls from comfort to prison. It was time to let go. Selling the house was not a decision I made lightly. It was a severing of ties, a relinquishing of memories intertwined with every brick and beam. I spent days sorting through decades of accumulated belongings, old toys, school projects, letters from friends, and each item was a fragment of a life shared, now tinged with loss. The process was a quiet reckoning, a farewell whispered in the spaces between packing tape and cardboard boxes. As I prepared the documents to list the house, I also turned my attention to my will. The legal papers sat on the dining table, stark and impersonal, yet heavy with the weight of finality. I had once envisioned Julian and Emily as the stewards of my legacy, the keepers of the family story. But their rejection had rewritten that narrative. With a steady hand, I removed their names as beneficiaries, redirecting my estate to friends and causes that nourished my spirit and values. The act of changing the will was both a shield and a statement. It was a way to protect myself from further hurt and to reclaim control over a future I could no longer share with those who had turned away. I chose to direct my assets toward a women's shelter, a place that offered refuge and hope to those facing hardships not unlike my own. In this decision, I found a measure of solace, a way to transform my pain into purpose. Walking through the empty rooms one last time, I felt the weight of memories pressing against the silence. I recalled Julian's first steps taken across the living room floor, the family dinners filled with conversation and warmth, the quiet moments of connection that had once seemed unbreakable. Now those memories were shadows, delicate and distant. The neighbors noticed the changes. A few stopped by with gentle questions, their eyes reflecting a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. I offered soft smiles but kept my thoughts close, unwilling to unravel the story that had become too painful to share. The house was no longer a home but a chapter closing, a book whose pages I had to turn even if the ending was unwritten. In the weeks that followed, I coordinated with the real estate agent, attending showings and signing papers that felt like small betrayals. Each signature was a step toward release, a quiet unraveling of the life I had built. The buyers were a young couple, eager and full of dreams, their plans for the house a reminder that life moves forward, even when we are left behind. As the sale finalized, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. The house was sold, the keys handed over, and the past folded away like a well-worn garment. The proceeds would provide me with security and the freedom to chart a new course, yet the absence of Julian and Emily in this process underscored the distance that had grown too wide to bridge. I found myself reflecting on the emotional turmoil that accompanied this letting go. The house had been more than wood and stone, it was the vessel of family history, a symbol of unity now fractured. But clinging to it felt like holding onto a ghost, a tether to a family that no longer embraced me. The decision to sell was not surrender, it was a painful act of self-preservation. In the quiet of my new apartment, I began to unpack not just boxes but fragments of my life. I arranged familiar objects on shelves, creating a space that felt like refuge rather than a reminder of loss. The memories of the house lingered, bittersweet but fading with each passing day. I planted herbs on the windowsill, basil, rosemary, thyme, as small acts of nurturing life and renewal. The change in my will was a secret I kept close, sharing it only with my attorney and a trusted friend. It was a boundary drawn firmly in the sand, a declaration that my estate would no longer be a battleground for fractured relationships. Instead, it would be a gift to those who needed kindness and support, a legacy of compassion born from my own heartbreak. Sometimes, in moments of quiet solitude, I allowed myself to mourn the family I had lost, the conversations that would never be had, the milestones that would pass uncelebrated. But I also felt a growing sense of somber resolve. This was a new chapter, one I would write on my own terms, free from the shadows of rejection. The house sale and will changes were not just practical decisions, they were acts of reclaiming my identity and dignity. I no longer needed to carry the weight of others' indifference or cruelty. Instead, I could focus on healing, on building a life that honored my worth and my values. As the days lengthened into early spring, I began to see the possibilities that lay ahead. There was a quiet empowerment in making these choices, a courage born from pain but not defined by it. The house, once a symbol of family unity, was now a stepping stone toward independence. Though the path was uncertain, I felt a flicker of hope. I would carry the memories of love and loss with me, but I would not be imprisoned by them. The sale of the house was an ending, yes, but also a beginning, a chance to find peace and purpose beyond the shadows of estrangement. And so, with a steady heart, I closed the door on that chapter, stepping into the unknown with a quiet strength that surprised even me. The day they discovered the sale was one I had anticipated but not dreaded. It arrived not with confrontation but with a hesitant call from Julian's number flashing on my phone. I let it ring, the silence between us stretching longer than any words could have. When I finally answered, his voice was thick with confusion and regret, a stark contrast to the cold finality of Emily's letter months before. "I just heard about the house," he said, almost whispering as if speaking louder might shatter something fragile between us. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you reach out?" The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. I took a deep breath, feeling the steady calm that had grown within me over these past months. You weren't interested in being part of this, Julian. I sent messages, I waited. The silence was my answer. My voice was gentle but firm, the resolve beneath it unmistakable. He faltered, the weight of missed opportunities pressing down on him. I didn't realize how far apart we'd drifted. There was a pain in his tone, a realization dawning too late. Can we talk? Can we fix this? But the fissures ran deep, and the bridge that might have connected us had been weakened by months of neglect and silence. I wanted to reach out to mend the fractured ties, but the wounds were fresh and raw. The betrayal of the letter, the years of distance, the coldness that had replaced warmth, they all demanded acknowledgement and space. "I'm sorry, Julian," I said quietly. "This isn't about anger or punishment. It's about protecting myself now. The house was a symbol of our family, but it became a reminder of what we lost. I had to let go." My words were measured, but behind them lay a quiet storm of sorrow and strength. He was silent for a long moment, the weight of my truth settling between us. "I wish I'd known sooner," he finally admitted, voice breaking. "I wish we tried harder." But wishes, I realized, could not undo the past or force a future that neither of us was ready to embrace. Emily's name was never mentioned, but her absence was palpable. I imagined her reading that same news with a detached indifference, the final act in a quiet severance none of us had truly confronted until now. Their silence had spoken volumes, and now Julian's regret was too late to bridge the chasm. After the call ended, I sat with the echo of his words, the mixture of sorrow and acceptance swirling within me. The missed opportunities were a heavy burden, but they were also a reminder that relationships require nourishment, effort, and mutual respect. Without those, even the strongest bonds can unravel. I thought of the years we had shared, the milestones celebrated, the ordinary days filled with small joys. All of it seemed both distant and immediate, a tapestry frayed at the edges but still vibrant in my mind. The price of their rejection was steep, a toll paid in silence and separation. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the boundaries I had drawn, the lines I had chosen to protect my heart. The decision to sell the house and change my will was not just practical, it was a declaration of self-respect, a refusal to be diminished by those who had turned away. Yet, amidst the pain, I acknowledged a bittersweet truth. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not always possible, and sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away. The hope for healing remained, but it was tempered by the necessity of boundaries that honored my dignity. I reached out to a close friend, Isabel, sharing the details of the conversation and the emotional weight it carried. Her presence was a balm, a steady reminder that family can be chosen as much as given. She listened without judgment, offering quiet support and gentle encouragement. Together, we discussed the importance of self-care and the courage it took to stand firm in the face of rejection. Isabel reminded me that healing is not linear, that grief and growth often coexist in the same space. Her words gave me permission to feel both sorrow and strength. The house sale proceeds had been placed in a secure account, earmarked for causes close to my heart. I imagined the women who would find refuge in the shelter I had chosen to support, their stories of resilience mirroring my own journey from loss to empowerment. It was a legacy born not from bitterness but from hope. As I navigated the complex emotions stirred by Julian's call, I realized that closure was not a singular moment but a process, a weaving together of acceptance, forgiveness, and the courage to move forward. The family I had known was forever changed, but I was learning to redefine what family meant to me. There were moments of quiet reflection when loneliness crept in, but also moments of clarity when I recognized the strength that had carried me through. The boundaries I had set were not walls but protective shields, guarding the fragile new life I was building. In time, I hoped that Julian and Emily would find their own paths to understanding, but I no longer relied on their presence for my peace. The choice to protect myself was not an act of bitterness but one of self-love, a necessary step toward healing. The phone call marked a turning point, a moment when the past and present collided with painful honesty. It was a reminder that relationships are complex, shaped by choices and circumstances beyond our control. Yet within that complexity there is room for growth and renewal. I closed that chapter with a quiet determination, carrying the lessons learned like a compass guiding me through uncertain terrain. The house was gone, the will amended, and the family ties altered, but I was still here, resilient and ready to embrace whatever came next. The journey ahead was unknown, but I faced it with a heart that had been broken and mended, a spirit that had been tested and tempered. The price of rejection was high, but it had also taught me the value of boundaries, the necessity of self-respect, and the possibility of new beginnings. The days that followed Julian's call felt like stepping into a new light, harsh at first, then slowly softening into something warmer. I realized that it was no longer enough to simply endure the silence and absence. I needed to build a life that could hold space for healing and growth. Alone, yes, but not lonely. That would be my new truth. I found myself reaching out, tentatively at first, to old friends whose voices I hadn't heard in years. Isabel was my anchor, her steady presence a reminder that connection could be chosen and nurtured, even when family ties had frayed. Over cups of tea in sunlit cafes, we talked about loss and hope, about the courage it took to let go and the strength needed to embrace independence. With her encouragement, I joined a local community group focused on creative arts. Painting classes, book clubs, even a weekly gardening circle each offered a small window into a world that felt welcoming and alive. At first, I was hesitant, unsure if I belonged, but the warm smiles and shared stories slowly chipped away at my doubts. Here, I found a new kind of family, one built on mutual support and understanding rather than blood alone. The proceeds from the house sale sat in my account, a quiet promise of security and possibility. Instead of allowing the money to merely safeguard my future, I began to envision ways to invest in my passions, things that had been shelved or postponed over the years. I enrolled in a writing workshop, something I'd always dreamed of but never pursued, and started volunteering at the women's shelter I had chosen as a beneficiary in my will. Each visit to the shelter was a reminder of resilience. The women I met carried stories of hardship that echoed my own pain but also shone with hope. Their courage inspired me, and in turn, I offered my time and energy, finding purpose in acts of kindness and solidarity. The work was humbling, grounding me in a sense of community and shared humanity. Establishing boundaries with Julian and Emily remained a delicate task. I answered calls sparingly, always careful to preserve my peace. When conversations veered toward recriminations or demands, I gently but firmly redirected or ended them. It was not easy, and at times I felt the sting of guilt or longing, but the boundaries were necessary. They were the scaffolding that held my new life steady. Friends noticed the change in me, the quiet confidence beneath the sadness, the way I carried myself with a newfound grace. I began to see reflections of strength I hadn't known were there. The small apartment, once unfamiliar and sparse, grew warm with personal touches. Photographs of new friends, plants thriving on the windowsill, books stacked in eager anticipation. It was a space that belonged to me, a sanctuary from the past's shadows. There were days when the weight of estrangement pressed heavily, when memories of family celebrations and shared moments stirred a longing that felt almost unbearable. But those days were balanced by the joy of new experiences, the thrill of personal growth, and the comfort of friendships forged in honesty and acceptance. I found myself writing more frequently, pouring thoughts and feelings onto paper. The act of expression was cathartic, a way to make sense of the complex emotions swirling inside. Sometimes the words were raw and painful, other times they sparkled with hope and clarity. Through writing, I began to reclaim my voice, telling my story on my own terms. Plans for the future took shape slowly but surely. I dreamed of traveling to places I'd never seen, of taking classes that ignited my curiosity, of deepening relationships that nourished my soul. The proceeds from the house sale were no longer just a safety net, they were the seeds of a life reimagined. One afternoon, while planting lavender in a small pot by the window, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. The scent of the herbs mingled with the sun's warmth, a gentle reminder that growth often comes from the smallest beginnings. I thought of the women at the shelter, the friends I had found, and the new life unfolding before me. Though the ache of family estrangement remained, it no longer defined me. I had chosen to prioritize my peace and well-being, to surround myself with love that was reciprocal and nourishing. The boundaries I had set were not walls but bridges to healing, to friendship, to self-respect. Occasionally, messages from Julian and Emily arrived, tentative and sparse. I responded with kindness but kept the distance intact, knowing that true reconciliation required more than words. It required time, effort, and mutual respect. For now, I was content to protect my heart while remaining open to the possibility of change. In this new chapter, I discovered that strength was not the absence of vulnerability but the courage to face it. I learned that healing is often a quiet, gradual process marked by small victories and moments of grace. And I embraced the truth that family can take many forms, chosen and cherished beyond bloodlines. The journey was far from over, but I no longer walked it alone or in despair. I had built a foundation of support and self-love, a network of friends and purpose that carried me forward. The future shimmered with possibility, and for the first time in a long while, I was ready to step into it fully. As evening fell, I sat by the window, the soft glow of the city lights reflecting in my eyes. The lavender's fragrance filled the room, a symbol of renewal and hope. I breathed deeply, feeling gratitude for the path I had chosen and the life I was creating. The past held its place in my story, but it no longer held me captive. I was learning to bloom again, quietly, steadily, on my own terms. The call came on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low, heavy with unshed rain. I was sitting by the window, notebook in hand, when Julian's voice buzzed through the speaker, tentative and unfamiliar. It was the first time he had reached out in weeks, his tone cautious, as if stepping onto fragile ice. "I think we need to talk," he said, the words simple but charged with years of unspoken tension. I hesitated, the knot in my chest tightening. Part of me longed for reconciliation, for the family I once believed we were, but another part guarded the wounds too fresh to ignore. I agreed, setting a time for the conversation that felt like both an ending and a beginning. When the moment arrived, I prepared myself not just with words but with the emotional armor I had been forging quietly over the months. Julian's voice was heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," he began, a phrase I had heard before but never truly felt until now. "For the silence, for the distance, for letting things get so broken." There was a crack in his voice, a vulnerability that made my heart ache. I listened, the years of pain and disappointment swirling beneath the surface. When it was my turn, I spoke with honesty, careful but unflinching. "Your absence hurt me deeply," I said. "The letter from Emily, the silence, it was a rejection I wasn't prepared for. It made me question everything I thought we shared." The conversation was raw, a delicate dance between blame and understanding. Julian admitted his mistakes, the ways he had avoided difficult conversations, the moments he had chosen comfort over courage. I acknowledged my own failings too, the times I had held on too tightly, the expectations I had placed on others. But the most important words I spoke were about the boundaries I needed to protect myself. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," I said softly. "It doesn't mean reopening wounds or returning to old patterns that hurt me. I want peace, but I also need to feel safe." There was silence on the other end, a pause heavy with meaning. "I understand," Julian finally said. "I don't want to lose you, I want to make amends, but I know it will take time." Time, that was the word that hung between us, both a promise and a challenge. I realized that healing would not be instantaneous, that the trust we once shared would need to be rebuilt brick by brick, cautiously and with care. In the days that followed, our conversations remained tentative, marked by pauses and careful words. I found myself navigating a complex landscape of hope and caution, eager to reconnect but unwilling to sacrifice my hard-won peace. The emotional confrontation was a turning point, not because it erased the past but because it acknowledged it with honesty. It allowed space for grief and regret, but also for the possibility of something new, something more honest and grounded. I reflected on the pain of betrayal and the resilience it had fostered. The boundaries I had set were not walls but protective measures necessary to prevent further harm. They were a testament to my strength and my commitment to self-care. Julian reached out occasionally, his efforts sincere but measured. I responded in kind, allowing myself to feel the cautious warmth of tentative reconciliation without letting down my guard completely. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience and self-awareness. I also found solace in my friendships and community, the steady presence of those who had supported me throughout. Their encouragement reminded me that healing is often a collective journey, not a solitary one. The experience deepened my understanding of forgiveness, not as a gift given freely, but as a process that unfolds over time, shaped by boundaries and mutual respect. It taught me that love can coexist with limits and that protecting oneself is an act of courage, not selfishness. As I navigated this new terrain, I continued to invest in myself, writing, volunteering, nurturing the passions that had blossomed in the wake of loss. These pursuits grounded me, offering a sense of purpose beyond the complexities of family ties. The conversation with Julian did not erase the ache or the history, but it opened a door to possibilities previously unimagined. It was a fragile step toward healing, marked by honesty and the willingness to face difficult truths. I held onto that hope even as I remained vigilant, knowing that the road ahead would be winding and uncertain. But I also knew that I had grown stronger, that I had learned to honor my own needs and to seek peace on my own terms. The reaffirmation of my decision to protect myself emotionally and financially was not a retreat but a declaration. I was no longer willing to be diminished or silenced. I would move forward with clarity, courage, and a heart open to healing but guarded against harm. In the quiet moments after the call, I sat with the complexity of my feelings, the sorrow, the relief, the cautious optimism. I realized that this confrontation was not an end but a beginning, a chance to rewrite our story with honesty and respect. It was a reminder that family, however fractured, can sometimes find a new shape, one that embraces imperfection and acknowledges pain without being defined by it. And that sometimes the greatest love we can offer is the love we give ourselves. As the sky outside cleared, light filtered through the window, casting gentle shadows across the room. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future entwined within me. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer walking it in darkness. I carried with me the lessons of pain and resilience, the courage to set boundaries, and the hope that, with time, healing could take root. This was my story, one of heartbreak and strength, loss and renewal. And as I looked forward, I knew that I would navigate it with grace, holding onto the truth that I, above all, deserved peace. The morning light spilled softly over my new apartment, casting long, gentle shadows that seemed to dance with the quiet promise of fresh beginnings. I sat by the window, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, feeling the steady pulse of a life reclaimed. Gone were the days when my heart was tethered to the fragile threads of a family that had chosen distance. Now I was charting a path defined by self-respect and clarity, and it was mine alone to walk. In these months since the last difficult conversation with Julian, I had learned the art of nurturing myself, not just the body but the spirit too. I threw myself into meaningful projects, small acts of creation that stitched together the torn fabric of my soul. I joined a local writing collective where words flowed like a river, unburdened by fear. The stories I wrote were no longer about loss alone, but about resilience, about women who had been silenced and erased yet found the strength to bloom again. My friendships deepened, becoming a tapestry of support and joy. Isabel remained a steadfast presence, her laughter a balm against the echoes of loneliness. Through her, I met others who had walked similar paths, women who understood the pain of estrangement and the courage it took to choose themselves. Together, we formed a quiet community, a sanctuary built not on blood but on shared stories and mutual care. The proceeds from the house sale, once a symbol of endings, now fueled my freedom. I invested in courses that ignited my curiosity: photography, creative writing, even a class on herbal medicine that connected me to the earth in ways I hadn't known I craved. Each new skill, each new friendship was a step away from the shadows and toward the light of possibility. Planting lavender on the windowsill had become a daily ritual, a symbol of growth and healing. The delicate purple flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their scent a reminder that beauty often arises from the smallest seeds of intention. I tended to them with care, much like the fragile hope blossoming within me. There were moments, of course, when the ache of family estrangement surfaced, quiet evenings when the silence felt too loud, or holidays marked by absence rather than presence. But these moments no longer defined me. They were threads woven into a larger tapestry, part of a story that included courage, endurance, and the fierce determination to choose peace. I reflected on the strength I had gained from standing up for myself, from setting boundaries that honored my worth. It was a freedom hard won, born from the ashes of betrayal and neglect. I had learned that empowerment is not about revenge or bitterness, but about reclaiming one's voice and agency. The clarity that settled over me was like a dawn breaking after a long night. I saw now that letting go of those who had edited me out of their lives was not a loss but a liberation. It was the first step toward healing, a necessary release that made room for the person I was becoming. In my quiet moments, I thought of others who might be walking similar paths, those silenced by family rifts, those erased by rejection. I wanted them to know that there is hope beyond the pain, that healing often begins with the simple act of choosing oneself. It is not an easy choice, but it is a powerful one. I began to write letters, not to send but to release the unspoken words, the grief, the anger, and the forgiveness I was slowly cultivating. These letters were a testament to my journey, a map of my transformation from a woman defined by loss to one defined by resilience. As spring unfolded outside my window, I felt its energy seep into my bones. The world was waking up, and so was I. Each day brought new opportunities to grow, to create, to connect. The past still whispered, but it no longer commanded my story. I embraced this new chapter with open arms, a quiet strength radiating from within. The scars remained, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of battles fought and survived. I carried them with pride, badges of a journey that had tested me and taught me the value of self-love. The future stretched out before me, vast and uncharted, filled with possibilities I was eager to explore. I was no longer waiting for permission to live fully, I had granted it to myself. And so, as the lavender bloomed and the morning light warmed my face, I smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because I had chosen to bloom anyway, quietly, steadily, on my own terms. If this story resonates with you, know that you are not alone. Sometimes letting go is the first step toward healing. Sometimes the greatest love we can offer ourselves is the courage to choose our own path and to bloom again, even in the face of silence.